Welcome to Straight Talk Vermont on NEK-TV with Linda Joy Sullivan. Our featured guest today is Ben Kinsley, our Politico expert and an expert in many areas and an influencer up at the State House. So, Ben, please introduce yourself for our listeners. Tell them a little bit about your background, and then let's delve into Straight Talk.
You already gave me such a good introduction.
You can take it away. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Ben Kinsley. I'm the executive director of Campaign for Vermont, and we are a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization that's focused on growing the middle class here in the state. So that's kind of our core central mission. But as you might imagine, there are a lot of things that influence the growth in the middle class, and so I think we're going to be talking about some of those today. But for me personally, my background is I grew up here in Vermont, went to school here, and worked in the State House for a couple of years, for in the executive branch as well as the some traditional lobbying firms, and then I've been with Campaign for Vermont at some capacity for over a decade now. So been here, and I think what we're doing is really impactful, and I'm excited about some of the things that we're seeing happen, quite honestly, in terms of policy discussions, and there's some things to learn from too, so I'm sure we'll talk about all of that today.
We are definitely going to delve into a lot of these issues, especially there's a lot going on up there this week and has happened the first couple of, rounds since it started again. We know we have to talk about education bills. We know we have to talk about the new cap bill that's been brought out by the senator. We know we have to talk about building the middle class, sustaining the middle class, finding the middle class.
Finding it today is the challenge, right?
Yeah, I mean, does it even exist anymore? We kind of watched for many years it dissipating, and we said, okay, eventually middle class is going to disappear, right? Well, we're there.
We are sort of there, and I think one of the things that's really interesting is you look at wage growth in Vermont for the last 50 years, so going back to 1970. And there has been material wage growth when you look at household income compared to inflation. Like, household incomes are outpacing inflation at a pretty healthy rate. However, the big asterisk to that is the biggest things that make up household budgets. Think cars, rent, healthcare, like those big ticket items that you spend thousands and thousands of dollars on every year, if not every month. Those things have actually exceeded the wage growth for the middle class. And so, those are the things we're looking at, right? Is how do we bring housing prices back down so that there's entry-level housing for folks? How do you reduce the healthcare burden, particularly when you look at the healthcare spending per capita? How do we bring that number down so that people can afford healthcare? How do we deal with skyrocketing property taxes and education spending, right? That's another big thing that we've seen, particularly this one's more unique to Vermont, but we've seen a 47% increase in spending since before the pandemic. And, if we look back to the 1990s when we passed Act 60, which is the whole education funding law that's in place today, if we look back to the late 90s when that was put into effect, we've grown at twice the rate of the national average since then in terms of education spending per student. So we've grown twice as fast as the nation as a whole in per pupil spending since we passed Act 60. And so that's something we need to address as well, because the cost of our education is now second highest in the country, and our quality is not second highest in the country.
So two things you said, one on education, we're going to jump into that in a minute. But you said something very interesting, and it's always made me curious, is the housing issue, the pricing of housing. It makes me curious as to what is the low level of housing that you believe is needed? I mean, is it that a $300,000 house is not affordable to someone who's middle class? Is that not a low end house? Is that considered a high end
No,
house, or is it the
that's
mortgage
the
rates? What is it?
yeah, that's the house we need. Quite honestly, we need a 300 or $400,000 house, and but those don't exist in today's market.
Well,
Those,
is it that they don't exist, or is it that they don't exist in specific areas? Like, there's also that criteria where I want to live near my family. I don't want to live in Vermont in the southern part or the northern part. I want to be within 15 minutes of my mom, and so
yeah,
it's not so much also just the houses don't exist. Is so much more to it. There's the transportation, there's where are the jobs, it's how do you work from home or not, the childcare. So is it the location of the houses closer to where the jobs are?
and that's definitely a component of it, right? Is are the houses near where the jobs are, where the family connections are? What we see, you see this a lot in Chittenden County, uh, is that people are commuting from 2 or 3 counties away, because the housing is cheaper. Of course, that drives up your transportation costs, and now your monthly expenses are much more variable based on what fuel prices are, and the wear and tear on your car, creates a whole nother expense that people that live closer to their jobs may not experience. And so I think that there is a lot of that happening. Most of the recent housing construction has been in Chittenden County. That does not mean that we don't need houses everywhere. Because the way that I look at it is, we've, as a state policy, we focused so much on the rental market for the last 30 years, building capacity in the rental market. Problem is, the rental market's starting to slow for some of the same reasons that the owner occupied market is starting to slow. But one of the real bottlenecks, I think, is those folks that are, paying $4,000 a month in Burlington or Montpelier, for a 2 bedroom or 3 bedroom apartment. They could afford that $400,000 house at $4,000 a month. The problem is there is no house available in that price range in their area.
Yeah.
So
And
there's no
also
jumping off
transportation.
point.
Transportation, we're Vermont, so it's not like you're living in New York where you can work in Manhattan at the higher paying jobs and then just
Yeah.
jump on a train and live in Queens. So there's no transportation here. And we've seen now there's going to be budget cuts in the transportation.
There's going to be budget
I mean,
cuts in the transportation sector. Yeah.
right. And, that's going to be very interesting to assess because I know they're cutting from everywhere, but, is transportation the ideal place to go? Or are
Well,
there more
especially,
top heavy people in the administration? I mean, how many directors and commissioners and so on are needed when the secretary could get out there and do the job? And so
right.
the key is hands-on people doing the work as the real lunchbox type workers that we had over generations, as opposed to titles and overseeing. And so where do you cut? So that's a
Yeah.
hardcore
Good question.
self audit that needs to be done, which is not going to be done. So we're going to get off that topic. So, but something
Yeah.
your campaign for Vermont might want to look at. But let's talk about quickly the landlord tenant issue. And because we
Yeah.
know now there's issues going on there, do you want to talk about what's going on in the legislature with that first? And then we'll jump
Yeah.
into the education.
So there's a bill in the House that was introduced by the chair of the House General and Housing Committee, and it was basically looking at this issue of there's actually a contraction in the number of rental units that are coming online. Like, specifically when we look at small, like, ADUs, so like someone who has an apartment above their garage or something like that, those are coming off the market, not coming onto the market. And so this is something that the legislature started paying attention to, is the fact that this pool is shrinking. Now, some of that is those units are being converted to vacation rentals, right? There's some level of that that's happening because their revenue is better as a vacation rental. But one of the big things that this bill is looking at is one of the concerns from landlords is the eviction process. So if they have someone who's not paying rent or is damaging the unit, they want to be able to get that person out and get them out quickly. And the amount of red tape you have to go through today is prohibitive. And so it's actually scaring a lot of landlords out of the market. Like, existing landlords are coming out, and there are not new landlords coming in to replace them. Again, we're talking like 1 or 2 units, like people who are managing those types of units. And so this bill,
has anyone offered any solutions? I mean, I guess landlords would turn around and say, okay, instead of giving me 1 month security, give me 3 months security, or though security can't be used for, lack of paying rent when you're sitting in there. I mean, there's guidelines for that also, but
Right.
then that makes it more prohibitive because people can't afford to come up with the lump sum of, say, 3 months of security and pay X amount of rent ahead. So they're in this, cat mouse kind of situation. So any thoughts on that? Has anybody turned around and said, what can be done to fix this?
Yeah, so this bill essentially, it creates a trade-off scenario. So it creates an expedited eviction process for cause, if there's eviction for cause, but it then bars eviction for no cause, so no cause evictions. So that does 2 things. One, it protects tenants. There's stronger protections for tenants because they can't get evicted for no cause. But if there is cause and the landlord can prove it, it's an expedited eviction process. So like, that's the trade-off that this bill is trying to set to address like that component of the market where you're getting those 1 or 2 unit landlords back into it with a better guarantee that if something goes sideways and the person they end up leasing to is not holding up their end of the bargain, they can get them out and get someone else in. But at the same time, not increasing the upfront costs, like requiring 2 months of deposit instead of 1, because that also creates a barrier of entry, right? If you have to pay your deposit twice. And we see similar issues on the homeownership side too, right? We can talk about that. Like,
Before we do that, have you seen an increase in shorter leases? In other words, if I know that I can't evict you, then I'll just give you 3-month leases. We'll do it every 3 months. And have you seen then a lack of desire to rent? Because who wants to move their family if they have to? Or, a single person might not be so concerned if there's larger opportunities to rent or a hotel to pop into during a quick job transition. But if it's actually going to be a permanent, long-term place of location while, say, a family is trying to save money to buy a house, they don't want a short-term lease. They want the security. So
yeah, so
what have
there
you seen
is there is another component in that bill that addresses the length of leases that are acceptable. And there's it's interesting the way the state statute works now in terms of what defines a short-term lease versus a long-term residential lease. And they might be playing with some of those definitions. There's indications in this bill that they're going to play with some of those definitions because, one thing we see a lot of is shorter leases, even 3-month leases, let's say, are pretty common for traveling workers. So if you have someone that's on a job site, so like could be construction, could be healthcare, where they have a shorter term contract, that they don't have a year-long contract, they have a 3-month contract, a 6-month contract, whatever. Those shorter leases are really popular with that group of folks, and that's a critical component of our social safety net in a lot of ways, right? Like you think about healthcare workers, or someone who's working in a specialized construction industry that you have to bring in from somewhere else. Like that's an important part of our workforce. So that's a consideration as well. It's like shorter term leases, maybe your deposit's not quite as big on those. Like maybe it's not a full month, maybe it's $1,000 or $500 or whatever it is. And so yeah, there's some creative things we can do there, I think, to get more folks into those facilities, as opposed to them just being short-term rentals. And there's this place for that too. Like short-term rentals, if they're being occupied, do create economic activity because
Sure.
people are here, they're buying groceries, they're shopping, they're
Sure. Going out to eat.
going out to eat. Like they are an economic driver, but there's got to be a give and a take, right? That if that unit is sitting vacant 3/4 of the year, and we just saw a bill that was introduced in the Senate this week that would tax vacancy, which I think is an interesting concept. So
I saw that.
if that unit's not being utilized for housing of some capacity, that's contributing back to the economy. Maybe we should be taxing that. I don't know.
So that's going to open up a lot of, I'm going to say, ethical, moral questions.
There's issues with that for sure. There's issues with that for sure. But it's an interesting concept, a thought exercise.
Yeah, well, it's always interesting when you want to tax, right? What can you tax? Why? How do you defend it? And if you can defend it, who can actually afford to pay it? And if they can't, then what happens, right? So
we have this. We see this debate a lot on our Facebook page. We have, one of the largest Facebook pages in the state, and one of the things we see, like when we start talking about property taxes and how it's so high, everyone's like, "Well, just tax second homeowners."
right.
And it's like, yeah, you can do that, but there's some interstate commerce issues, so you can't just tax second homeowners from out of state. You've got to tax everyone who is, so that means your summer camp, your hunting camp, whatever is getting taxed at that second homeowner rate. And by the way, second homes are already taxed at the same rate as businesses. So today, are you going to tax second homes at a higher rate than any other kind of business? Especially like that, you start getting into interesting questions when you start talking about that, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, and you also have these, I'm going to say, innocent second homeowners. Somebody inherits a house and all of a sudden, boom, they're a second homeowner. Not that they want to be, not that they could even afford that home by itself, but now they're kind of stuck with it. You can't abandon it. You can't get rid of it. You have to carry it. And so now they're going to be taxed as well. They'll just throw them right out of their first home. So there's a lot of issues here. You're talking about commerce. And so when you're dealing with commerce, legislature and commerce don't always mesh. And then the experience of people who are making these bills, they're more intellectualized than they are having had their own experience in actually living within these situations or seeing them from a business standpoint. So there's a lot out there.
It's an interesting comment, Linda, because I know you were in the legislature, and so this is not directed at you, but I do believe that the makeup of the Vermont legislature is not representative of the demographics of Vermont.
Great.
And there are some reasons for that. It's hard to run. Well, the way that the state originally structured a legislature, the thought was it's going to be mostly farmers that are serving, because it was, January through May legislative set. Really, back then it was through April legislative session. It was something farmers could do in the winter when, the responsibilities of the farm were not what they are today. And so that's the way it was structured. It was structured around an agrarian economy. We don't have an agrarian economy anymore. So the types of people that can afford to take 4 months off, 5 months off from work and go to Montpelier are not farmers. They're, people who are independently wealthy, doctors, lawyers, business owners,
or their children,
or their children, or people who are retired.
Right.
And so what you get are a lot of folks that don't have lived experience in the economy because they're sort of in an ivory tower, if you will, where their experience in Vermont is very different than everyday people, and that comes out in all kinds of ways, right? And we see that a little bit in these like landlord tenant debates. We see it in the housing debate. It's
Sure,
like
housing, education.
education. I have my house. I've had my house for 40 years. No, I'm not. I'm just saying, like as
No,
a
right,
legislator,
of course.
right? I've had my house for 40 years, and my payment is $500 a month, and like they're and they don't they're not out in the housing market facing the challenges that you know people my age in their 30s or whatever that are trying to buy a house and start a family or whatever, and it's incredibly difficult. And there's no one in the legislature, very few people in the legislature that have that perspective
Yeah,
of what it's
right,
like.
you're absolutely right. Now, I saw that when I was in there.
Yeah,
I mean, and I brought that up several times when they tried to do the second tax, the second home. There were issues and questions raised that I thought were important to raise. So it's just a matter of, the life experience. But right, and I don't believe that a lot of people are aware, and thank you for bringing that up, that it was formed based on, the farming industry. And
yeah,
that's who was expected to be there. But it's evolved.
yeah.
And you're
It's
trying to fix things now to accommodate your newly enticed people to come here, your newly enticed people to stay here, as well as your people who were born here to be able to stay and retire. And if they have retired, not be isolated and desolate, right? So, there's
right.
a lot going on here. This is, a big kaleidoscope of human beings that are being influenced by all of this forward movement as well as prior foundations. So I appreciate what you're doing, but now I want to talk about education, if
Of
you
course.
don't mind. Do you want to dump us on, just dump everything that's going on there? Tell us where you want to go with this, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I do want to put a pin in that last conversation
Sure.
about people leaving the state. I hear from people all the time who are, we had to leave, we couldn't afford it here anymore, we couldn't find a house, or conversely, we grew up here, went away for school, we want to come back, we can't afford it. Like we can't. Like I have a job. Like they have a job. Their partner has a job. They're like, we can come back, but there's no house for us to buy. There's nowhere for us to live, and I hear that all the time. And the numbers, by the way, the numbers, by the way, back that up. There's in 2020 alone, 6,000 people moved out of the state, and that's a pretty significant
That's a
chunk.
significant number for a state of 10, what's 10%, right?
That's almost 10% of the
Yeah,
state.
right.
Yeah,
Wow.
people of the population left in
Right.
2020.
And that's just the people who have left, right? Not people who deceased, right? That's just people
Right,
who
those people were
left.
left, and by the way, our birth rate is not keeping up with our death rate. So yeah, let's call it.
Exactly.
That's there's a term for that. I think it's negative population growth is like when your death rate is exceeding your birth rate, and
Right.
Vermont has that. There's a report this week actually that Vermont's the slowest growing state in the country. It's experiencing negative growth. So that's a problem, and we need in-migration to fix that, but we have nowhere for people to live.
Right. But then again, the key is people have jobs in some of the statistics. They have jobs. Did it identify where the jobs were? Or is it only people working for the state or people working across the state? I mean, does the report identify that?
So there are jobs open. In fact, we have pretty historic job openings right now. It's not clear exactly what the distribution of those positions are. They service positions? Are they, higher paying positions? Like what exactly is that distribution? But also in a post-COVID economy, there's a lot of people that are coming with jobs that have,
Right.
jobs that are remote or close to fully remote. And if they moved here, they're bringing that revenue into the state. And most of those types of jobs are pretty high paying jobs. So that's like tax revenue we could be getting that we're not, because there's no house for that person.
And those people who are generating that type of revenue most probably would like to live in areas where they're closer to cities and things that are going on, right? Where they could just go out and go to eat, walk,
Yeah,
because probably coming from, that type of service is probably coming from those types of districts in other states. Yeah,
they
it's different
probably
to
are
them.
looking. Yeah, they're probably looking for a quieter lifestyle if they're coming here
Mhm.
from New York or Boston. So they're probably not necessarily looking to be in a city, but they
Yeah,
are
except
probably
the
looking to
cities
be
here to the cities in there are kind of quieter.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think the type of person that would want to move back is looking for move back or move in, looking for something that's relatively quiet but has good amenities, like
Right.
restaurants and stuff like that, shopping, and relatively close to an airport. So like those types of places, you think are mostly ski towns, to be
Right.
honest.
Mhm.
You're thinking like Stowe, Killington, Manchester.
There you go.
Um,
That's right, the
they're
typical
relatively
golden
rural,
areas.
good dining options, and they're all
Mhm.
close to airports.
Right,
So
and that airports are so important, in the development of airports with appropriate anchors. That's the key is what are the anchors at the airports, not just having a runway. I
yeah,
mean, it's what anchors are there and how developed for economic development are the airports themselves, because that's what's
right.
going to drive a city.
What can they accommodate? Yeah,
Yeah,
and do they have direct flights to major hubs like New York and Chicago or Atlanta?
right,
Yeah.
right. Huge. That's huge. But let's get into education now.
All right, let's talk education. Yeah, so this is an issue that Campaign for Vermont's been involved with for a long time. In fact, one of the co-founders of our organization helped to write Act 60, its current education financing law, and we worked on Act 46, which is the consolidation bill from 10 years ago that a lot of people seem to have forgotten about.
Hmm.
But that was the original major consolidation bill. We went from 270 school districts down to 119. So that was a pretty major consolidation. And then, we're having a very similar conversation today in the legislature about, you know, do we force consolidation? Do we just provide incentives for consolidation? Do we look at other cost saving mechanisms? Obviously, the one thing everyone agrees on is that the funding formula needs to change. So
And
like
be
that's the one
understood.
thing,
Yeah.
yeah, and be understood. One of the challenges with the current funding system is that it creates a tragedy of the commons situation where it's like your property tax is only loosely connected to your local spending. So your local school could level fund this year. Your property tax could still go up 5% because every other district in the state is increasing 5%. So that's a phenomenon that happens, and what that does is it incentivizes this sort of like reading of the tea leaves by the people who write the school budgets. Like, okay, what do we think statewide education spending is going to increase at? Because if it's going to increase at 3% or 5%, which has been the average for the last 25 years, about 5% a year. If we think it's going to increase at 5%, well, we better increase our spending 5%, because if our tax rate's going up 5%, at least we have something to show for it. The problem is everybody does that, and it creates a tragedy of the commons situation where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of like, okay, we think everyone's going to go up 5%, and everyone's going, well, then I should increase 5% because my taxes are going to go up that much, and this is how we end up with, insane spending increases
Spending. Yeah, right. Exactly.
25
Without
years.
the correlation of the reality of the increases of the yeah,
The thing
the
that's dramatically different, though, between Act 46, the conversation around Act 46, and the conversation today, aside from like you could literally copy and paste a lot of the things that are being said, and I can circle back to that. But the one thing that's really different is when Act 46 was written in 2014, we had one of the best performing education systems in the country. We were top 5 in math and reading at 4th and 8th grade levels. Like, we were one of the best.
Do
In
we know
2020.
why?
There's a lot of speculation as to why, but I think what it comes down to is teachers who are really focused on students and what student needs were. Today, we are below middle of the pack, particularly in the 4th grade math and reading. We're
Crucial time frame too. Fourth,
right.
fourth, fifth, and sixth grade.
So if you look at a map of, or a graph of the standardized testing scores, the national standardized testing scores that every student in the country has to take, Vermont has seen a precipitous decline. It's almost a straight line, especially in 4th grade reading, straight down from 2015 to today. So we are now less than middle of the pack, below middle of the pack. But then but that's just face value. If you adjust for our demographics, Vermont is a very white student population. Non-Hispanic white is the technical term that we use for that grouping. Vermont has the largest of that population in the country out of any school system. So if you adjust for that, those demographic differences between what Vermont looks like and the rest of the country looks like, we'd actually be bottom 5. If you adjust for those demographics. So, and poverty as well. So like you adjust for the non-Hispanic white population and you adjust for poverty rates, and we would be bottom 5. And yet we spend the second most on a cost per student basis. The only state that spends more than we do is New York. And they only do that because their salaries are much higher than Vermont's, which is another pain point because some of our best teachers we lose to New York because the salaries are much higher. So, so we have challenges. We have real challenges. I think the two things I can point to that got us to where we are is obviously Act 60, and we talked about that and funding formula. And we have a very small and shrinking student-teacher ratio. So we have about 10.5 students per teacher as the last time we measured it. The national average is at 15. And the next closest state, so Vermont is the smallest, but the next closest state is 12.3. Almost 20% higher than Vermont's in terms of class size averages. So it's like the rest of the country, and then there's a few states,
curve.
And then Vermont's like way down here. So moving our staffing ratios back in line with, at least the grouping of states that are in that 12 or 13 range, if not up to the national average, would reduce our cost per student significantly.
Do you know which areas in Vermont have, for that 4th grade, say, level, the higher reading levels? Where have they tested out the best, or where have they shown, is it like the Northeast Kingdom's higher or lower than, say, the Brattleboro area or the Manchester area? Do we know?
So we haven't looked at regional differences. We do know that there are individual districts that perform very well, and others that don't. So for example, one of the interesting things we looked at is the cost per student on a cost per student basis. Is there a correlation between what Vermont school districts spend on a cost per student basis and the outcomes that they generate? And there's no statistical correlation between spending and outcomes. And there's also no statistical correlation between the size of the school district, so the number of students that are in that school district, and either the costs per student. So there's no correlation between the size of the school district and the cost per student. And there's also no correlation with the outcomes that those students get. So like this is an interesting finding because it tells us a little bit that like bigger school districts don't necessarily perform better. And there's some examples of this. One of the largest school districts in the state is Winooski. They also spend the most per student out of any district in the state. And yet their outcomes are pretty abysmal. Like we have a number of kids that don't their graduation rates under 60%. They have uh, the vast majority of their students fail standardized testing. And yet you have small districts that have a low cost per student that, these students do really well on standardized tests and have a high graduation rate.
Is there any correlation between the educational level of the teachers and their license requirements? If they have to have, like, do they have licenses? Are they still earning licenses while they're allowed to teach? I mean, what have you found out on that?
Yeah, we would love to look at that in Vermont. Like, what are the teacher qualifications
Sure.
versus student outcomes? The national literature on this is pretty clear. Um, the quality of the teacher absolutely matters. It is, in fact, it is the best indicator outside of household income, actually a little
Mhm.
bit more than household income. What's the best predictor of student outcomes? It's the quality of the teacher. So we look at what's interesting. There's a big headline in Boston, in the Boston Globe this fall, about how Mississippi students were outperforming Vermont students and by the way, Mississippi spends about half on a cost per student basis what Vermont does. And yet Mississippi has over the last 10 years, like how Vermont's been declining, Mississippi has been increasing their student outcomes. One of the ways they did that was science-based curriculum. So they overhauled all of their curriculum so that it was science-based teaching, and they put in teacher evaluations to make sure that the teachers in their schools were the highest quality that they could find, and then they put into place an accountability framework so that
There you go.
if schools or school districts were not hitting expectations, there are repercussions for that. There's a mechanism to hold them accountable. All three of those things are missing in Vermont's education system.
And also, have you looked at the legislative bills and laws that have gone into effect with what teachers are required to have and how things have changed? Being more lax for licensed professionals in the state of Vermont. That's
There's
kind of the
certainly
driver.
there's certainly been an increase in the number of unlicensed teachers that are, like, we call them provisional licenses, is what the state calls them, but basically it's you can't find a licensed teacher who's available. So you find an unlicensed teacher and you hire them under a provisional license, with the assumption that they are working towards getting a full license. So we've seen an increase in the use of provisional licenses in Vermont, or like since COVID, basically. But the interesting bit is that that increase really started happening during COVID, but our student performance decline started before COVID. Like it was started back in 2015, 2016. So there's more going on there than just the provisional licenses and the number of like new teachers, if you will, that are in the system. There's more to it that's going on there. It,
Have other things come in, say around that 2015, where they're more well focused on more assisting students for their emotional health, those kind of programs going on during that little curve, 2015 and forward, going away from, say, sit in your seat and here's what you're going to learn, and more of resources and going out there that teachers were forced to use to accommodate the day.
yeah, so there were three things that happened in that time frame. First one was Act 46 happened in that time frame. It started being implemented in 2015, and the final round of consolidations happened in 2019.
Okay.
So, it's hard to, in any of these three things, it's hard to draw a correlation because they all happened at the same time. They did not happen in isolation.
Sure.
But there is a reasonable assumption that when you upend a school system and a school board and you're forcing them to look, you know, next door for dance partners to consolidate with, they're taking their focus off of the quality of education that's happening in the schools, right? There's only a limited amount of bandwidth those school boards have. And when you're focusing them on consolidation efforts and not on quality instruction, that distraction is going to have classroom impacts,
And
right?
then transitions, once they get there, it could take 5 to 10 years before something even, surfaces that okay, now we've got it.
Now we've got it.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely disrupting the kids when you go through a consolidation effort like that. The second thing that happened was proficiency-based learning was implemented in the same time frame. So this is basically, instead of getting a letter grade, you get a proficiency score, and depending on which district you're in, you could get a proficiency score on 17 different proficiencies or 55 different proficiencies. And because there's no letter grade, it's a little hard to understand like how a student is actually doing. So this has
Could
been a
also
problem.
impact the allowance dollar value for you didn't bring home an A, you're not getting that $10, right?
Yeah, like it's hard for parents to understand, is the feedback. It's hard for colleges to understand on college applications. And it's monumentally time consuming for teachers. They spend so much time with this new grading system, that again, is probably distracting them from classroom prep and other things that they could be doing, interventions and whatnot they could be doing to help their students. So that is a potential concern as well. That's factoring in. And by the way, there's only one other state that had done proficiency-based learning before Vermont did. It was Oregon, and they rolled it back
Back.
uh, while Vermont was implementing it because for similar reasons. So there's a lot of reason to be suspicious of that as a mechanism and why our student populations or our student performance is declining. The third thing, and you sort of alluded to it, was a change in how we handle special ed kids
Right.
who have behavioral issues. And again, this was a pre-COVID policy, but the spike in behavioral issues during COVID really exacerbated this. But the policy was basically trying to keep kids in classrooms as much as possible. So basically the shift was, instead of pulling kids out of classroom and putting them in, a separate learning environment, is basically to throw paraeducators at them. So like you have a kid who's having a behavioral issue, you put a paraeducator at them in the classroom. So you keep them in the classroom, but you add the para to like try to have a one-on-one interaction with that kid and manage the behavioral issues inside the classroom with all the other students. Problem is, if you have 2 or 3 kids in one class that are having behavioral issues, you now have a classroom with 4 adults in it. You have a teacher and 2 or 3 paras potentially, and 2 or 3 kids that are acting out that are distracting the rest of the class from actually learning, aside from the fact that having 4 adults in a classroom is not distracting already. So that shift in how we handle behavioral issues inside schools also could have had an impact on student performance.
I would think so. I mean, also, regardless, kids are kids. So if you see any type of acting out, and you see that they're going to get attention from getting an adult, it's like, well, I'll act out. I want my own adult.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's just the way it works, right? And so, yeah, there are definitely concerns about the way things are going on here. What do you think is going, now I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball. What do you think is going to happen with the education priority of the governor?
Yeah.
And the fact that the task force did not do what it was charged to do, and the task force and the legislature now saying, who cares? We're going to just work on it and see how we get it. We've passed that charge of what you told us to do and what the law said. Now we're just going to do whatever we need to do to fix it. So where are we going with this?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure. And this is going to be the story of this legislative session for sure. Like there is nothing else that is going to capture center stage quite like this issue is. And you have, Act 73, and how you interpret the mandate in Act 73 is, it's a little gray, the way that the terminology is. A lot of people interpret it as you need to draw maps for school district consolidation. The way the language actually is termed is like you can choose to draw maps for school districts or supervisory unions is the way that the language is written. So either way, it's a governance change, but the new governance units either need to be that are being that the maps are being drawn for either need to be school districts or supervisory unions. Is basically the way that the language is written. And supervisory unions in Vermont are sort of weird because nationally they're classified as education service agencies. But in Vermont, we view them as part of our governance structure because the superintendent lives within the supervisory union. But really, ESAs nationally are responsible for providing a whole bunch of services like special education, CTE, languages, HR functions, ARAP functions, like all of your back office functions, basically. And they do that in order to achieve efficiency of scale because like school districts can share those resources. But we don't do that in Vermont. The only services that we provide at the SU level are chief executive functionality with the superintendent and his staff and special education. And our scale is also quite a bit different than what we see around the country as well, because, we have, I said earlier, 119 school districts, and we only have 52 supervisory unions. So we basically have 2.25 school districts for each SU. And around the country, we might see 5 or 10 districts that are part of each one of those ESAs. So, Vermont we could have consolidated supervisory unions and increased their charge in terms of what services they provide. And that was within the realm of the task force charge in Act 73. What the task force looked at when they started looking at all of this, they were like, well, national literature says that consolidations don't save money generally, more often than not. And if they do save money, it's only for the very smallest districts under 300 students. And we agreed with all of that, by the way. We've done our own research on the national literature, and they're right. Very small districts, there may be some cost savings. Most of those small districts were already consolidated under Act 46. So there's not a ton of those left. And if we did consolidate all of them, it would be very minimal cost savings, even if we forced the consolidation. And then, so you have this low of like 300 is where you get 300 and below is where you get the most cost savings. And then past 3,000 students, you actually start seeing diseconomies of scale. Like your cost per student starts going up again. So there's this level off between 300 and 3,000 where you're like, you maybe get a little bit of savings, but not much. So somewhere in that range, you're mostly good. Well, Vermont's average is 600. That's the average.
Interesting. Okay.
So you could consolidate some, but you're probably not going to get a ton of cost savings from it. The research, and this is basically the conclusion that the task force came to. So they're like, district consolidation doesn't make sense. What they proposed instead, and I think it was a little bit of a nod to the governor, like trying to get him on board, but they proposed a structure of 5 or 6 regional ESAs that would sit on top of the supervisory union. So the map looks pretty similar to what the governor had suggested, consolidating down to 6 districts. The map looks very similar to that, but instead of districts, they're ESAs. And so the ESA can absorb all of these shared business services. And that was the map that they put forward back to the legislature. Problem with it.
Go ahead.
A couple problems with it. But the governor basically viewed it as because he wanted to see districts and not ESAs or supervisory unions. He wanted to see districts. So he basically called it the task force didn't fulfill their mandate. And in some ways they didn't, because they chose to create a whole new governance structure instead of, changing the ones that we have. And the legislative leaders largely agreed with that. They were kind of, and my read is that they were reluctant to disagree with the governor on the task force mandate. So that leaves us with the legislative committees trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what do we do, because no one likes the governor's proposal of let's go from 119 districts down to 5 or 6. But most of them agree something needs to happen. Basically, everyone agrees something needs to happen. It's just a question of what it's going to be. So the Senate seems to be very inclined towards the ESA concept, along with some consolidation, perhaps voluntary, of smaller districts with some incentives. But they seem to be on that train. The House seems to be on the we're going to draw maps and we're going to force consolidation from the statewide level. And what the districts are going to be and all that remains to be seen. But it's going to be very interesting because the governor and the House and the Senate are not on the same page as of right now.
Right, and you know my feeling about putting legislators on that task force to begin with. So I had always had that conflict control issue there. But regardless of that, it's not only costs though that they're looking at. They should also be looking at the increase in the students' education, right? I mean, wasn't that part of the mandate as well?
Yeah, and I quite honestly, I think it's a little bit of a misguided mandate.
Right.
In Act 73, because we saw in Act 46 too. Act 46 started out as, oh, this is going to be cost savings. And then over time, the language shifted and it's like, oh, no, it's not about cost savings, about equity and access to services, right? Because the assumption was that bigger districts could perform better. But as we noted, we've done 2 different regression analysis on Vermont's school district data, and there is no statistical relationship between the size of the district and the cost per student or the outcomes that are generated. So we know that bigger districts don't perform better on either a cost per student standpoint or an outcome standpoint, and the national literature agrees with that. Like there's very little evidence that bigger districts are better. What's better is districts that have strong accountability frameworks. That's what's better. And Vermont does not have that. So governance changes are, in my opinion, largely a distraction. I think there's not a lot of cost savings there. There's not a lot of educational benefit there. What we really need are stronger accountability frameworks, and the new foundation formula that was proposed in Act 73 introduces accountability on the spending side of the equation. And then the next thing we need is a framework for accountability on the outcome side. And that is not.
Is there going to be a new? It's not even there. But is there going to be a new task force with new people assigned, or the same, or is the task force just gone?
Task force is gone, technically. It wouldn't surprise me if there is another task force that is formed, because legislators, and this happened, same thing with Act 46, legislators were very reluctant to put lines on a map, right? They did not want to do that. And so they did the same thing in Act 46. They punted to the State Board of Education, said, you draw the maps. And they did the same thing here with the task force this time around. You draw the maps. Task force came back and said the parameters you gave us didn't make sense, right? Especially because one of the parameters in Act 73 was the size of the new districts needed to be between 4,000 and 8,000 students. Well, based on the national literature, that's actually going to increase the costs per student if we do that. And so that was one of the things that the task force came back and said, well, we looked at the literature and this doesn't make sense, what you're asking us to do. So the ESA concept, though, is interesting because we proposed ESA in a similar ESA concept, but by consolidating supervisory unions. And by the way, one of the interesting things is we did this regression analysis on Vermont's education data at the SU level in 2014. We did this. It was the last time we did this report. And that time we looked at the SU level data, not just the district level data. And what was interesting is at the SU level, there is a statistical relationship between the cost per student and the size of the supervisory union.
Really?
So the larger the SU, there is actually a cost difference, not at the district level, but at the SU level. And so that led us down the road of looking at the supervisory unions. And we came to the conclusion that Vermont's supervisory union structure is unlike any other ESA in the country. And they are they're not being leveraged properly for cost savings, and they're also not being leveraged properly for access to services. And I'll give an example of that. So
Sure.
what I said earlier is, there's really only two services that Vermont supervisory unions provide. It's chief executive functionality through the superintendent and his staff, and special education. There are examples where SUs have done additional services, but those are the two that are in statute that are required. And there's only a little over two school districts per SU, so the scale is much different than what we see elsewhere. So consolidating those SUs around, in our model was consolidating them around our career and technical education centers, because that solves another problem where like the CTE centers are kind of this like separate parallel system that we have that doesn't integrate well with our primary education system. So consolidating those SUs around our career and technical education centers creates that really strong post-secondary workforce pipeline, because they're now integrated into the same system. And in fact, all of those school districts are now feeding into that CTE. And it gives us a scale. So that would give us about 15 of these supervisory unions or ESAs or whatever we want to call them in the future. That gives us better scale. That's more similar to what we see in other states, both from a geographic footprint as well as a number of students. So that would increase number of students per SU up to about 5,000, a little over 5,000, whereas today there's 1,600. And then we push services up. So more than just special ed, push up, business services like HR, IT, accounts receivable, payroll, all those things that we can gain efficiencies of scale from. And then the other thing that it opens up, which is really interesting, is you can provide some low frequency services. So like languages, for example, arts classes, things like that are very specialized that not a ton of students take advantage of, but you want to offer it as an option. You can move some of those up to the new ESA or SU level. And then every school in that region gets access to those services. And so you're actually expanding access by doing that. At the same time, you're cutting costs. And we did an estimate in November. We put out a report that estimated what the cost savings would be from going to that model. And it's over $300 million that we would save by just doing that alone, and not touching. That's before we touch any school districts at all. Just doing that ESA SU consolidation and pushing services up saves over $300 million.
Have these evaluations that you've been doing with Campaign for Vermont, have they been shared, or have they even been requested by the task force?
The task force was interested in it. We were giving information to the task force while they were developing their policies, and much of what we gave them they agreed with, and some of it ended up in their final report. The cost savings report that we issued came out the same week that they wrote their final report, so they were not able to include the cost savings component. And their ESA model looks a little different, because ours was like consolidate SUs to gain that efficiency of scale and their concept was to layer a new structure on top of the SUs for that to achieve that scale. So their model is a little bit different, but the concept was very similar. Is that the ESAs are a better path to getting, and less disruptive path to getting to cost savings.
So we have 5 minutes left. I have one question on this, and then I want you to run with how you'd like to close out your last 5 minutes. Sure. So even with the maps being changed, that's going to influence the housing issue, because if the school districts are changed, there's going to be people who are going to want to get rid of their houses and move to closer proximity to where they've been assigned. There's going to be those who now have to purchase homes in those school districts. So there's going to be a big influence there. And we'll get into that when I request you to come back. And we're going
to have to see what the maps are going to look like, right?
Yeah. But so how would you like to finalize this show?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, legislators are still very much undecided on exactly what these are the final version of this is going to look like. Like I said earlier, like the Senate is leaning more towards like voluntary consolidations at the district level. Some of that is happening already, but try to achieve administrative savings through an ESA model of some kind. And then the House is much more on the forced consolidation train. It's not, neither one of those is set in stone, and they're all both going to have to rectify that with the governor and what he wants, because he's now threatened to veto the state budget if he doesn't get an education bill that he likes. So that's something to contend with as well. So what I would say is it really comes down to now is a good time to be talking to your legislators, especially if your legislator happens to be on either one of the two education committees, the House or the Senate Education Committee, or one of the two money committees, the tax committees involved, which would be House Ways and Means or Senate Finance. If you have a legislator on one of those committees, talk to them, write an email, pick up the phone, call them, tell them like, hey, these are the things that I'm concerned about. Here are the things that, that I care about. I don't want to lose my small school, or I can't afford my property taxes. It's going to force me to move to Florida or New Hampshire or whatever the case may be. Like, tell them that and talk about the immediate cost savings, or we touched on it earlier, at least cap education spending for the next 2 years or 3 years until we sort this out, because we can't keep spending at 5% increases. Vermonters can't afford that. We can't afford our property taxes. So talk to your legislators, send them an email, give them a phone call, and then also go and sign up for our newsletter, because we're following all of this. We have a great newsletter.
How do they do that? How do they sign up for your newsletter?
You can go to our website, campaignforvermont.org, hit join, and you can sign up for the newsletter. You can also sign up for our legislative updates, which are once a week, that keep you in the loop about what's going on. Both of them are great. Both of them keep you informed, so you can keep up with all this stuff.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ben. As always, you are like one of my favorite professionals to have on this show, and I can't wait to get you back. This has been Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan. Thank you, NEK-TV, and thank you, Ben Kinsley, and we will see you next week.